Hello and welcome to The Fire These Times, a podcast at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. This is the first episode of 2021, and I wanted us to start this year by talking about Silicon Valley. Now, I know that this might sound weird, maybe out of context even, but I think we've reached a point where we need to come to terms with the fact that we're living in a world heavily influenced by what we usually call big tech. So, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft. But we can also include other giants such as Twitter, and of course subsidiaries of these giants such as Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp, and so on. If you're listening from the US, you're likely very aware by now of what happens when authoritarian actors take advantage of certain designs on websites and apps like Facebook or YouTube. The fascists who stormed the Capitol on January 6 were undoubtedly radicalized on social media, with the help of Trump, of course, himself addicted to Twitter, as well as the people around him. But this conversation focuses on another angle, and it goes beyond just social media. So I spoke to Katy Cook about her book, The Psychology of Silicon Valley, Ethical Threats and Emotional Unintelligence in the Tech Industry. This book offers a revealing look inside the mind of Silicon Valley, and how the identity, culture, myths, and motivation of big tech are harming society. Katy, who will introduce herself in a bit, walks us through the psychological landscape of Silicon Valley, including its leadership, ethical and cultural problems, as well as what to do about them. So although this is US focused at times, this is not a conversation about that country only. In fact, I bring up the UK and I bring up the Middle East in general as part of my own experiences with the effects of social media and the tech giants. I will be having more of these conversations in the near future as I myself dig deeper into the philosophy and politics of big tech and explore ways to approach the many faceted challenges ahead. So as usual, if you wish to support this podcast, you can do so with a small monthly donation on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For other methods, including one-offs on PayPal, please visit the website, and you can also help out by just leaving a review wherever you get your podcast. Alright, here's my conversation with Katy Cook on the psychology of Silicon Valley.
So my name is Katy Cook. I am a social psychologist, and I am the author of The Psychology of Silicon Valley, which is about the ethical threats and emotional unintelligence in the tech industry. And I am based in Southern California. I'm from San Diego.
So in the intro to the book, you mentioned how you started wondering about the psychology that was creating technology itself. So can we kind of get a bit of background here? How did that start and where did it lead? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, for sure. So I started looking into this stuff around 2011, and I was really interested initially in the addictive kind of elements of tech, which I think is what brought a lot of people in kind of early on. That's what a lot of the early research papers and the early literature is on. And then I got kind of just deeper into it, and I would read about, job loss and automation and potentials there. And then a couple years later, started seeing some more of the social harms around polarization and misinformation and things like that. But what really interested me as a psychologist was kind of who was creating this technology, right? Because it's not just coming from nowhere. People are responsible for the products and services of everything that we use, whether that is, everyday products or vehicles or dating products or whatever it may be. And we have to, medical products, we have to, I think, trust and also appreciate the psychology behind the people in those industries, right? We have to trust that they have our best interests at heart, and we have to kind of understand if they don't, why that might not be the case. And so I started thinking about, well, who are behind these products and services, and what might that mean for us in the future? And those kind of questions just about, what causes things and where they come from are really interesting to me. So I started looking into the psychology of the industry, the psychology of decision-making in the industry, and comparing it from kind of the early starts of the tech industry and what the values were back then to what they have kind of merged into and evolved into currently, which are very, very different pieces. And I go into that a bit in the book. So it was really just a curiosity for me about where our technology comes from, what kind of people create it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't often think of something like Silicon Valley as even having a culture, like an identity, myths, foundational myths and motivations, and like any of the world's cultures basically might have. But not only is that the case, But you also argue that Silicon Valley doesn't actually think of itself in honest terms, that there's this contrast between how it views itself for the most part and what it actually does. So can you kind of flesh out the contrast between these two, and like why is it this stark?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think there's two things there to consider, right? So the first is this idea of thinking of the psychology of any kind of group, right? And a lot of people don't think of psychology beyond the psychology of an individual. And I think that's a really important place to start, is that we have to understand that, cultures have kind of dominant psychologies and countries and groups of people, and whether you're, far right or far left, or a feminist or an anti-feminist or whatever, there's going to be certain psychological similarities between and amongst groups of people. And you could go on forever, right? This applies to sports teams, this applies to religions, this applies to, community groups, it applies to any kind of group of people. So first and foremost, a lot of my work is just convincing people that a group like Silicon Valley does have an identity, it does have a culture, it does have a dominant psychology around it. The second part of your question, I think, is equally important, right? Like, why is it not honest about itself in terms of what it is and kind of what it actually does out in the world, and why is it so stark between those two things? And I think the answer for me, and I go into this a bit in the first section of the book, comes down to, this is a problem of self-awareness, right? And self-awareness is one of the four components of emotional intelligence. And it's, in my opinion, probably the hardest, because developing good self-awareness means you have to suspend this belief that you're the hero in your story, right? We all want to think of ourselves as the kind of the leading character, the hero, the best, like the person who's going to save, the world, or do the best in this industry, or whatever it may be, right? And it's hard to look at the kind of shadow side of that and admit our shortcomings and admit when we cause harm to other people. And Silicon Valley just doesn't do that very well anyway. But you take the fact that it's really, really hard to have good self-awareness for anyone, and you couple it with a couple things, one of which is that this is an industry made predominantly of very left-brain techie people who are not trained or educated in things like emotional intelligence, which is something you can very much learn and very much train in, but most of them are not, right? Ethics courses are just being introduced in CS courses across the US and the globe, but ethics is not something most people are trained to think about. And ethics isn't even emotional intelligence. It's related, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
So you don't have a good basis, you don't have a good psychological basis within this group of people for developing these skills and looking at these skills anyway. And then the last part, which is probably the most problematic part, because you can't teach your way out of this the way I try to, teach emotional intelligence to people, is this is coupled with a lot of money and a lot of power that drives or encourages the behaviors that cause harm, right? So not only have these behaviors and these kind of norms within these products become okay and normalized within the industry, you're now getting, more money and more power generating advertising-based products that polarize people, that drive misinformation. And that power and that money is very, very addictive. And that makes it even harder to develop the self-awareness that you really need to look honestly at yourself and at your industry and your company and say, like, yo, what are we actually doing here? Are we doing good? Oh, maybe not. Like, we should maybe slow our roll a little bit and just look at ourselves and see what we might be able to do a little bit better.
There are lots of people in Silicon Valley who aren't comfortable with what's going on. I think it's fair to say. And you've quoted people like, Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, and who called the modern internet anti-human. And Ethan Zuckerman, who happens to be my previous boss at Global Voices, which is a bit funny, as calling it a fiasco. And we have seen this line of thinking getting more and more common, I think, in recent years. And, it's fair to say, especially since the disinformation crisis, as we might now understand it, around 2016 with Brexit, with the Trump election, this has gotten definitely more buzz than it did before. And myself focusing more on Syria, I would say that it even started beforehand, because there was these sorts of dimensions, or these sorts of tensions happened in Syria as well, with the case of the Russian government especially, and therefore also in Ukraine. Which is why for me, I would just put it as kind of a parenthesis, which was for me, this topic is also very urgent. It has this other dimension to what we are talking about here as well. More recently, we have seen the documentary on Netflix, like The Social Dilemma, and there's lots of critiques to it, and it's not really the main topic of conversation, but it definitely helped get this conversation, I think, even more quote unquote mainstream. And especially the work of folks like Jaron Lanier, Tristan Harris, and some of the others that were mentioned in the documentary, getting more attention, as I said. And the feeling is that basically something went wrong. And although it's not always easy to pinpoint what exactly. And, this is in no way an easy question, but like, how would you answer the what went wrong question? And maybe if you can highlight some of the people that you've spoken to while researching this book, that work in Silicon Valley, and sort of like their takes on it, and especially those that are clearly uncomfortable with what's going on as well.
Yeah, I think that is a super hard question, because there's a lot of things that went wrong kind of simultaneously, right? And then that also encouraged other things to go wrong. And I think for me, a lot of it in my research came down to values. So I talk about values a lot in my book. I think values are incredibly important. I think conversations around values are incredibly important. And I think one of the biggest things that, to use your words, kind of went wrong in tech over the years, over say 15, 20, 30 years, whatever you want to start, is that there weren't any checks, right? There weren't any kind of sense checks about, okay, well, what are our values now? Have they changed? Have they evolved? Are we still true to the values that we started out with, or are these shifting? And in the same way, oh, well, is our mission still a good one? Is connecting people a good idea and giving everyone a voice a good idea? But there just wasn't a lot of self-questioning. There wasn't a lot of sense checks. There wasn't a lot of stopping and pausing and looking around to say, like, really, how are we doing? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I don't think anyone knew how this was going to turn out, right? No one set out to cause harm. And I think that's super important to say. Everyone thinks they're doing the right thing, the best thing. They're the hero in the story. And there's just no kind of regulation for this yet. Back then, when things started going wrong, right? It's so complicated and so complex and technical that people in other jobs and other industries don't understand it. They don't understand, the data collection. They don't understand the power behind that, the implications behind that. When it comes to social, they don't see the problems that could arise there. And the lack of self-awareness really means that the founders and the drivers of these companies couldn't see those things coming either. And so without like a lot of self-reflection, without stopping and a lot of internal criticism and dialogue, it's really, really hard to stop something that's kind of a slow drip like that, right? That's kind of intermittently, slowly changing over time. And it's the same way that you can, become addicted to something. You aren't the first day you try it, but over time, it's going to get more and more and more, and you're going to need more and more and more. And the same way that if you're making revenue, you're going to want to make more and more and more. And a lot of the problem, I think, comes down to exactly what, Jaron Lanier says in The Social Network and all of his writing kind of elsewhere, is that this business model emphasizes the wrong things. It's really built on this kind of hyper-capitalistic Wall Street mentality, like growth at any cost, advertising is the way forward model, and that's not going to end well for anyone and solve any kind of social problems, right? Just throwing ads at stuff and gluing our eyeballs to conspiracy theories on YouTube. That's a really bad business model to follow. So I think the what part is very well extrapolated in The Social Dilemma. I'm not sure the why part is, but we can talk about that later. The what went wrong, though, I think that's exactly it. I think the business model is, built on very, very, very bad values currently.
Yeah, well, part of the why is, I mean, I can maybe get your take on this as well, is that, as you hinted at as well, like those who were supposed to do the legislating and those who were supposed to do the reining in had no idea what was going on. They were not trained, and for the most part still are not trained in even understanding what data is. And I'm saying this as someone who is barely starting to understand how data actually functions. It's not easy. It really isn't easy. And I'm doing a lot of like self-educating and work on that to compensate for all these years, even though up until recently, I was an active user of Facebook, of Instagram. I provided, therefore, a lot of data. I still have Twitter, although I'm not as active anymore, but still I'm providing data, and Gmail, YouTube, all of that as well. And it's very, very difficult to kind of wrap your head around. Probably now a bit easier, thanks in part to stuff like The Social Dilemma, which is why I still recommend it, even though it has its flaws, like any documentary does. But yeah, I do think that's why I'm bringing it up here. So, in your opinion, what is the why?
So the why, in my psychological opinion, and I have to admit, because this is my field, I'm probably biased, right? And there probably are other people who would argue that there's a different why, and there very well might be competing whys as to why.
There's multiple whys at the same time.
Right, in the same way that there's multiple whats of what went wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And multiple hows of how we might fix it. So to my mind, the why comes back to, this is a very homogeneously educated and minded community that creates technology. The technology is coming from something up a bubble, and that bubble has a very specific mindset about how you fix problems. Their mindsets tend to be, well, there's a technical fix for that. There's an app for that. We can code our way out of that. And there's I think, I don't know what the right word is, deprioritization, or like looking at everything else as kind of inferior in a way, any other kind of fixes or solves. So I think there's a sense of kind of tech is the best, and tech is the only way to kind of fix problems. So there's an elitism there as well, and a lack of respect for other kind of modalities and interests. I think there's a lack of emotional intelligence. So that's my real answer. That's the why to me. And there's different reasons for that. Like, emotional intelligence isn't, taught in a lot of STEM or any STEM programs that I know. And you can develop it on your own. You can certainly have emotional intelligence for a lot of reasons personally, whether it's an experience you went through, or the parents that raised you, or culture that you were raised in, or whatever it might be. But that was not what I encountered when I did, hundreds of interviews for this book. There was not a lot, especially in leadership, of the kinds of things that would go into making this industry emotionally intelligent. And those things, for anyone who hasn't kind of read up on how you break down emotional intelligence, are self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, and social skills. And when it comes to those four things, there isn't a lot of any of it in the industry. And you see a lot of writing by some of the more kind of reflective technologists about the empathy deficit in Silicon Valley. And I think that's a huge piece of it for me, is that, there isn't a lot of thinking about other people and what the effects might be, not just on the customer, but on society at large. And if you have empathy, those are the kind of questions that you just naturally ask, because you're curious about the experience of other people. So it's not only a self-awareness problem to me, it's also a problem um, of thinking about others and, as important as yourself, right? And thinking about how this affects your community and what the measures are that you might take to make sure that your products or services meet not just their individual kind of needs of how they're using your product, but the greater social needs that they have. And so if you understand human needs, right, and that's a whole other area of expertise, but you have your basic needs like biological needs, so food, shelter, that kind of stuff. You have your psychological needs, which are plentiful, right? Like mastery and contribution and um, growth and all these kind of like self-actualization kind of things. And then you have your social needs. And that's really what I think a lot of, well, especially social networks, obviously, but technology in general has really tapped into this need um, for connection without kind of thinking about the implications or the other needs that people also have, right? Which is like feeling part of a group, feeling part of something. Well, if you have to understand like tribalism to understand how those needs kind of are gonna play out and potentially be problematic. So I would say it's a problem of huge scope, which could be, a little bit better served if there was more diverse thinking in the industry that wasn't just kind of, techie in nature.
Yeah, and I mean, also parallel to everything you just mentioned, and around the same time, we also saw this huge glorification and deification of the entrepreneur, usually pictured as a dude, and having this, a lot of capital, financial obviously as well, but even cultural capital has been just harnessed to create this image of the tech genius. And I love tech. I have a lot of good opinions of the potential of technology as well. But when it then gets personalized in this specific way, which obviously what comes with it is sort of putting onto the table the actual power and the influence and the lack of regulation that makes this possible in the first place. This is where problematic territory really comes into play. And I'll transition to the other question, which is one of the reasons it could be difficult to actually talk about Silicon Valley is that we tend to speak about it as a homogeneous thing. And I've been describing it as it, for example. I mean, I know which is just a short kind of a shortcut in this conversation, but it has its limitations. That being said, I know it's diverse. I know there's a lot of different people in it who are either in it or were in it and have a kind of a dissent position to it now and so on. And this is also important. But taking all of that into account, it still seems, at least from the outside, that regardless of these internal differences, the pressures pushing for the status quo tend to just win at the end of the day. And, we can speak a lot about the fact that so many employees within Facebook are so uncomfortable with how things are going and they wish Facebook were better and so on. And it can be better, of course. But at the end of the day, it does seem to be a one-man decision-making team. And, it does go back to Zuckerberg himself. And this in itself, like, even if he was the nicest person on the planet, which he isn't, and even if he was, even if he had emotional intelligence, which clearly lacking quite a lot in that area as well, it's just too much power in the hand of one person. And that corrupts, that does create these kinds of problems. So it's like both personal and structural, and this goes back to the many whys and the many solutions that also have to be brought in at the same time. But would you mind explaining, maybe as a, let's say, to be fair to the conversation, why it is helpful to remember that Silicon Valley isn't homogeneous, because at least doing so would highlight the contradictions from within as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And this usually comes up, I would say, in every conversation I have about this and about the book, is that as a social psychologist, or, if you were a cultural anthropologist or a sociologist, this would be, a similar issue. When you're talking about big groups of people, you lose a bit of nuance. That's the way it's going to be, because you're looking for themes, right, within the group, especially in this case, challenges, because you want to be able to kind of look at what's going wrong thematically and how you might be able to address that so the world doesn't, burn down. But you're right. So when I talked to people for my book research, and it went over probably a couple years, and there were about 250 or so 100 people, I would say the only commonality for me was that almost everyone was really nice. Like they were all good people.
Right. Yeah.
Except for one story, which I won't go into on this podcast. But there were a huge spread of viewpoints, experiences, opinions about what was going on. And it was one of the best experiences of my life, because it was really fun to get all those stories, right? And to like get into people's understanding of what was going on, because a lot of it was super subjective. It depended on what company you worked at. It depended on, even who the CEO was at that company at the time. So if you were at Uber under, Dara, it's going to be different than if you were under Travis. And, each of those obviously present two different, sets of challenges, but
Sure. Yeah.
it's really interesting that even the same person, if you talk to them under two different sets of leadership, can have a very, very different experience. So it's not just that there's lots of people, it's that we're kind of different people from day to day. And that's something I used to try to remember when I was a psychotherapist and would work with people one-on-one, is that your client is going to be different every time you see them. They will have changed, they'll be in a different mood, they'll have different experiences from the last time you saw them, and kind of mapping how complex that gets with an entire industry of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people, millions. I'm not even sure. I haven't looked at numbers recently, but like, that's a huge, task to try to whittle down and get, themes out of. So yeah, I totally appreciate that, you and I call it or Silicon Valley right now. And that kind of depletes, I think, sometimes the nuance of people's experience. And they might say, well, I don't resonate with that. I don't see the lack of emotional intelligence or the sexism and bias in tech, or whatever it may be. And that's fair to them. That's their subjective experience. And my job, as I saw it, was to kind of capture the thematic challenges so we could try to address them in a healthier way. But I think that's a super important thing to talk about.
Yeah, that's fair. And a big component of Silicon Valley, to go back to the is that
Let's do it. Yeah.
there is definitely a sense that it is untouchable, and they are untouchable. They are above a genuine accountability. They are definitely above any kind of regulation. Recently, we're recording this mid-December 2020. Recently, we've been hearing about some of Facebook's troubles with antitrust laws. For those who don't know, I barely understand it myself, to be honest, but I do know that it is a concern within US law that Facebook is basically too powerful, and it owns, which is an information that is a bit very difficult to even wrap my head around, that the four most used apps in history are all owned by Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and obviously WhatsApp. And each of them have over 1 billion users who are using those apps. This is a clear example of data monopoly, a term which I've recently started properly understanding, again, because of the issue of understanding how data functions. And part of why it is being tolerated is precisely that. Most people don't understand how data works, what data even is. It's just so vague to most people. And that's one of the failures, I think, of modern systems, to keep it very, very broad, very vague here, like political system, education systems, and everything. It's definitely something that needs to be tackled on multiple fronts at the same time. Even in the UK, just last year, the UK's competition regulator said that the government, and I'm quoting here, should tackle dominance of online giants, end quote, as well. Whether or not the antitrust laws actually go anywhere, there's a lot of doubt on that, I know, because it's Facebook, so they're very powerful. it does seem that this will continue for the foreseeable future. And it's not just Facebook, obviously. I'm just using one very obvious name, but Google as well, the others as well. So my question is more like, how does a culture, like from a psychological perspective, let's put it this way, how does a culture which clearly views itself as beyond accountability react to attempts to hold it accountable? I have lots of difficulties imagining them just accepting it, which, I mean, they're obviously already rejecting it. So like, how do you see that being played out?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fight. It's not something that you lie down and just roll
Right,
over
yeah.
if you're Facebook or Google or any of the other ones. I think problems of accountability in these cases are essentially problems of power, right? So powerful people, and that can be, not just Mark Zuckerberg, that's Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein
Oh,
and,
absolutely.
any other kind
Everywhere.
of, yeah, usually white male people, um, think that they're, if they have power, that means that they don't have to be as responsible and accountable as the rest of us. And that's something that goes back to another thing I talk about in the book, which I think is a super interesting part of psychology that I am really, really passionate about and interested in, which is this idea of the power paradox. And the idea, Desher Keltner, who's at Berkeley, has a whole book on it, I think. And the basic idea is that the social and emotional intelligence that you have, whatever that may be, say it's an 8 out of 10 when you start a company, is damaged by the experience of power. So the more power you get, the harder it is to maintain whatever emotional and social intelligence you had going into that position. So I doubt that all three of or four of those men that I just mentioned were as drunk on power and as kind of resistant to, I mean, maybe Donald Trump, I don't know, resistant to accountability when they were, say, like 15 or 20, like maybe, but I really doubt it, right? The experience of power gives people a very false sense of what is important, of how you have to answer to society and to other people. It diminishes your empathy significantly. And of course, this is something I try to point out over and over again throughout the book, that emotional intelligence, and there's research to back this up across lots and lots and lots of different industries, emotional intelligence is highly correlated with ethical decision making. So if you're not emotionally intelligent, you're going to have a really, really hard time being ethical, because ethics is grounded in this idea of, okay, well, what's the best thing for society? And what's the best thing for the greatest number of people? And what's the best thing for the greater good? What's the right thing to do for, not only myself, but for everyone around me? And if you don't have emotional intelligence, those questions are nearly impossible to ask. So if you start with low emotional intelligence and then you get a lot of power, like, good God, you're in a really, really bad position to be, running a company that determines the fate of democracy or, mental health or whatever it may be. So I think the other really important part of that you touched on in the beginning is that people don't appreciate, well, I think we're starting to, but historically we have not appreciated how powerful our data is and how important it is, and how much the world and these companies run off of our data. And there's some really interesting ideas about how we fix that, whether you pay people for data or you pay for services, but does that then, create a divide between people? They're really complex problems. And I remember in 2014, a couple colleagues and I set up a campaign, like a one-day campaign called No Data Day. And the principle behind that was to have people kind of go dark for a day, take their data into their own hands, take it away from these corporations and see the financial impact, and to try to educate people about just how much power they had and they should have, rather than the other way around, rather than these companies having power over them.
Yeah, I mean, if this actually happens on a global scale and we just don't use any of these apps or websites or whatnot just for a day, half a day for that matter, the consequences will be severe on these social media giants. I already mentioned the social dilemma, again bringing it up just because it's probably many people probably have watched it by now. Some of the specific arguments put forward there, we already mentioned them. We've been talking about them in a way. But I'm thinking especially of folks like Jaron Lanier again, and Tristan Harris, and Shoshana Zuboff even, and some of the others. I'm very bad with names. They've denounced the business model of Google, Facebook, and the others. The fact that algorithms, there's a techie side to this question, but there's, I think, a psychological side to this question that is, well, more interesting in this conversation now. They are put in, these algorithms are put in place to harvest data the most effectively from a profit-seeking perspective, obviously, not from any ethical perspective. And these tend to promote hostilities, polarization, misinformation, disinformation. I'm very familiar with the latter two. I've been working on that myself. With polarization and hostilities, I have to admit that it took me much longer to recognize that I was also taking part in it. On Facebook first, and then when I deleted Facebook, it's like I compensated by going at it on Twitter. And it is very difficult for myself. I'll just speak about myself. It was very difficult for me to recognize, and which took some while, because I basically had to test myself. I had to do some kind of like minor experiments, not that these were peer reviewed or anything, trying to ask myself whether, like, I opened YouTube, let's say, whether I had intended on then spending 2 hours on YouTube. And the answer was almost always no. It starts because obviously the algorithm is extremely good at not just finding the patterns in my viewing habits and the clicks and the histories and the length and all of that, which, this might be the more techie aspect of it, but also trying to guess, and often extremely accurately, which can be very scary. Amazon does that as well, of like what you may want, let's put it this way, or what you think you may want. At least they can implant the need as well. The question is, from the psychological perspective, we are talking about addiction here. This is an addiction mechanism. How can you explain it to people? And I'm basically asking your help here, let's put it this way, because I have struggled to explain the addiction part to most people around me. I'm doing it a bit better now, although it took a lot of time to get there. But even now, I basically tell people, well, try not to use it for a while and maybe you might see the difference. But it's so vague, and it's very difficult if you're just using it on an average basis, on a daily basis, to actually see the harm that can be done, both in the short term, obviously, but especially in the long term. And then at some point, 12 years have passed, because that's how long I've been on Twitter. I had the anniversary notification recently. You wonder, well, how much of those 12 years have been conscious decision making, have been really me being actively participating on that site? And to be honest with you, the answer is scary. I don't think the majority of the time I was on there was mostly conscious decisions. I think at some point the addiction kicked in. So that's a very difficult question to you.
Yeah, and it has a lot of layers too, right? Well, first of all, I would say happy anniversary, because that 12 years is longer than I've committed to anything.
It's very long.
Very long. It's a really hard question, right? Like, so I don't know if you know anything about nudge theory at all.
A bit.
A little bit. Okay.
So mention that as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it kind of does what it says on the 10, right? Like you create different kind of experiences for people, or different opportunities for people to kind of nudge them in a certain direction. So one really good example is in the UK, I believe you are automatically opted in to be an organ donor. And if you don't want to be one, then you put the sticker on,
right.
Which has, created a lot more, organ donations, whether like compared to the US, where it's the opposite, you have to opt into that. So that's just one. There's a lot of, there's nudge can be used for really, really good things and really, really bad things.
Yep.
So it helps, helps the flow of traffic in, train stations and underground stations and stuff, with arrows and, pictures of people doing it the right way and not whatever. So one thing I've learned about how to nudge myself when it comes to these kind of things, because I'm just as susceptible as everyone else, um, is I create the circumstances where it's harder for me to go on these things. So at one point, I put every app I had in one big file, all mixed up. And in order to get to what I wanted to go to, I had to like scroll through all of them. And it was just more of a pain in the ass, right? It created one more step for me to get to what I wanted. And therefore, it was less likely that I would, rather than if it was just straight up top on my phone and I saw it every time I opened my phone. Another good way for me is to remove apps from my phone altogether. So I no longer have a Facebook app on my phone, even though I still have Facebook. I no longer have a Twitter app, even though I still have Twitter. I only go for the apps that I feel like actually enhance my experience as a human being and, create good conversations or good, meaningful connections with people. And Facebook and Twitter for me don't accomplish that in any way, shape, or form. So those have gone. It is really hard though, like you say, and in my opinion, it shouldn't be left to people to, manage this all by themselves. This is really the responsibility of the companies who are creating these
Absolutely, yeah.
kinds of technology with this kind of really depth knowledge. This is the only, I think, really hardcore knowledge of psychology that they have, is how to create, addictive behavior models. And they teach this at like places like Stanford. And I forget the name of the class, but it teaches like Bell Hooks model of how to, make people want to come back for more. Is it Hooks? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, like the leveraging of psychology for, for kind of nefarious or like addictive purposes is it's not even hidden. Like people do this very knowingly in the industry, and I'm not sure if they feel bad about it or not. I would hope so, but by all accounts, it doesn't seem like it. Um, but in terms of the social dilemma, I know you mentioned that. I think that's been really helpful in kind of driving awareness towards these things and helping people understand what's really going on, because most people just, there's so much in our lives and so much news and so much information to take in that unless it's presented in a really compelling way, the way I think they did in that movie, and as you say, it does have its shortcomings. I think it was a good kind of first introduction to these concepts for a lot of people. So it is just kind of moving the needle from now on, whether that's with little nudges that we do for ourselves or regulation that we impose upon companies who try to do this to us.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up that this is a structural problem as well. At the end of the day, if these technologies were different, then we would have different outcomes. It really is that simple sometimes. I have gone through so many different ways of dealing with social media addiction. Like, it's actually ridiculous if I list them all. I probably don't even remember. From everything from deleting the app to putting it in a hidden place on the phone to, I'm not going to go through them. Pretty much everything that one can think of, which actually has been helpful, because I do start seeing certain nuances in how I myself react to these things, because I am, as I said, I do like technology. I love the history of technology much more than the current forms of technology, although there are good things being done today as well. It is a nuanced conversation. The problem is that, and this is where I'll bring the second question. The stakes are just so high at this point, and the scale is so beyond. And like, if we were talking about even 1 million people that were on Facebook, that would already be a big deal. But now we're talking about over 1 billion, and the fact that that same company has those other other three apps, sorry, that also have over 1 billion each. I mean, that is data harvesting on a scale that we never were able to do before. And this is developing at the same time as the quick development of technology itself, the pace of technology itself. And, for rightly or wrongly, sometimes we focus a bit too much, I think, on what, let's say, China does in China. And for the wrong reasons. I think we should focus on what they do wrongly, what the government does badly in terms of the surveillance mechanisms and the oppression, all of that, for that. But sometimes I feel like the conversation then gets turned into, well, they only do it there, it could never happen here. And that's just not the case. And it's just that we do have better democratic institutions here, obviously, but they are flawed. They have their innumerable shortcomings, as we have been seeing in the past 4 years, just to focus only on those past 4 years. And the stakes, as I said, are now high. Like one of my personal obsessions now, in addition to what I mentioned before, like the political consequences on the ground, like when it comes to Syria and stuff, is global warming. And we are dealing right now with a situation that requires both quick thinking and also long-term thinking, and like thinking on multiple levels at the same time, and multiple aspects of the economy at the same time, and politics and cultural and personal, pretty much everything about us as human beings at this point, which is possible. It's not impossible, but it is not easy. And if the structures in place, literally, to go back to the nudge example, if they're literally nudging us all the time, and it's like we have to fight against the wind all the time, that makes it more difficult than if we were walking in the same direction as the wind, And one of the problems, you do mention this, like the technical fixes that often Silicon Valley, but not just Silicon Valley, like the oil companies do that. It's a big corporation thing. It obviously benefits them. They say that they want to be part of the solution that they are causing. So it's like, oil companies investing a tiny bit in solar energy and that sort of thing, and then having entire PR campaigns about it, as we all know. The question to you, I guess, also from a psychological perspective, and I will try and see if I can make sense of this. A lot of this is usually called techno-optimism, rightly or wrongly. I think the term is actually misused sometimes. But if we think of this as techno-optimism, basically that we have this optimistic view of technology that is doing more good than bad. Let's put it very simply. The other side of that binary would be techno-pessimism. I'm sort of in between. I sometimes hover to techno-pessimism. Sometimes so I'm not fully. When it comes to climate change, I then go to techno-pessimism, to be totally honest. But I'm not fully set yet. Let's say it's not a fully developed thought. From a psychological perspective, is it even helpful to use terms like techno-optimism and techno-pessimism? Like, does it say much?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about that before. Is it helpful? So it's really helpful for people psychologically to be able to orient themselves with things that feel familiar. So
Right.
When you're talking about like how you feel about technology and techno-optimism versus techno-pessimism, in my mind, and I'm a super visual learner, I see it as like a bell curve, right? So most people are probably somewhere in the middle, like me and you.
Yeah.
Some days we feel a little darker and are a little more pessimistic
Yep.
on certain subjects. And then certain days, we're like, oh, actually, like these technologies are doing really great things, and maybe there's hope. But there's there's fewer people who are purely one or the other. But I think it is helpful as kind of an orienting, start to the conversation. And the really important thing that I think people forget about having any kind of divide between, left, right, center, optimist, pessimist, traditionalist, progressive, whatever the kind of dichotomy may be, is that it's really important to have both. And so whether you're on one side of that, whatever side of that, dynamic you fall on, you have to, respect the fact that these things are like a delicate balance, right? And if you just had one or you just had the other, it wouldn't be kind of this, there wouldn't be the same kind of progress. Progress doesn't work because there's one group and they, take charge and go gung-ho on one course. Like progress, and I did my PhD is on the psychology of progress, so I love this topic. It's a really interesting kind of dance between two sides, right? And so the pessimists maybe that will point out things that are going wrong, and I probably come across as more of a techno-pessimist in my book because it seemed silly to sit there and list all the great things about technology.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, if you're a techno-optimist, like, that could, it's good to be reminded that there's good things too. And like this conversation between the two, as long as it remains kind of respectful and civil, I think is a really, really great thing. What the dangerous part is when it doesn't, right? When it kind of becomes super polarized. There's more people kind of in the extreme parts of that bell curve, and it to the point where it's not even a bell curve anymore, right? Like the extreme right, extreme left, like that can be potentially really problematic because people then don't have conversations, don't listen to each other, don't respect the other side of the issue. And that is not how progress works. Like that is how, like splitting of societies works. So I think when it comes to these kind of these terms, I think they can be really helpful, like a good way to visualize it, especially for people like me. But I mean, it might not be for everyone, but I like it.
Yeah, I do think it's useful. What it becomes less useful, let's say, when that becomes the thing that people use to then start thinking about it. That it becomes an identity thing. Like I'm a techno-optimist, therefore the answers are sort of, well, they're already there. They're written in advance, and that's not how, just things are just more complicated than that. I kind of had this thought, I thought about it, it related to an earlier part of this conversation about Trump specifically, given that he is thankfully on his way out now. I mean, he was never, I'm not going to psychologize him, but definitely there are quite a lot of evidence that he was always problematic, let's put it this way. But there's also quite a good evidence, and Jaron Lanier himself mentioned this in one of the interviews on Channel 4, I believe, because he had met him and whatever, that he believes that Trump actually got worse after his addiction to Twitter kind of kicked off. And I kind of see it. I don't, I wouldn't say I have deep knowledge into the guy to say this for certain, but it does definitely seem to be the case that it encourages him to be put in a box. Essentially, when you put in a box, all of his worst instincts kind of kick off. And, we see this quite a lot. And so there's two parts to this question. Okay, I will ask it directly first because so I don't get confused. Some of the skills in the way forward section on your book, sorry. Can you kind of go through them, not necessarily all of them, like as many as you want, but like, why do you think, and you have mentioned this already, but kind of to get into it a tiny bit more, sort of like the stuff like self-awareness, emotional control, power to the people, social skills, empathy, all of these things. What's your case, let's say, for all of them being thought about at the same time, rather than just one instead of the other?
Okay. Yeah, I'm really happy you asked that. Actually, I love talking about this stuff. Okay. So I go into things like leadership and empathy and like self-regulation, and I kind of use like case studies in a way to point out like where that doesn't happen a lot in the tech industry, right? So like Elon Musk is a really good example of bad self-regulation.
I can't believe I didn't mention him yet. Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
Right. I don't like to talk about him more than I have to, but what's another? And Donald Trump, obviously, really bad self-regulation. I'm not sure Donald Trump has any of the elements of emotional intelligence. I'd have to think about that. Maybe some social skills, not sure. But yeah, I think the one point to make about all of those things kind of in conjunction and the importance of doing all of them at the same time is emotional intelligence specifically kind of works as a group. So it's not that, you can't be better at one than the other. Like I have a quiz for emotional intelligence on my website, and I always score highest on one of them, which is empathy, and then lower on, a couple of the other ones. But they all kind of work together. So if you develop your self-awareness, you're more likely, if you're in touch with, your strengths and weaknesses and your own emotions and what's going on for you, you're more likely to be sensitive or adept to, or even curious about what that looks like in other people, which would naturally then develop your capacity for empathy. You might also, if you're empathetic to other people, be able to regulate yourself a little bit better so that you don't say offend them or upset them or say something mean that's going to make them cry or whatever it may be. So they all kind of work in this conjunctive kind of like a whole way. And then some things are outside of that I recommend. So like talking about leadership, there's different ways of doing leadership. I don't think there's one right way, but I think there's a shift over the last, say, like 10 or 20 years about what good leadership looks like, and that it isn't, ruling with an iron fist. It isn't always being right. It isn't being, always talking the most or being like super strong and aggressive. It's more the capacity, I think, to listen and to empower people and to make other people feel like they have the capacity to be leaders as well, and giving people, maybe setting a vision, but then trusting people enough to go out and work towards realizing that inspiration that you've come up with. So there's different things that I think are done well or not done well in leadership across Silicon Valley. In general, I think older and let's say over 35, 40-year-olds leaders tend to do these things better, just because they've had more life experience, they're more mature, they're more likely to have developed emotional intelligence, just because they've probably gone through things that have required them to do so, whether that's relationships or hardships or life challenges or whatever it may be. I think another kind of useful thing that kind of follows on, or useful topic that follows on from this, is talking about like emotions themselves, right? Like, people don't understand emotions very well. And I think that is a hugely challenging part of this, right? So like, no one that I've met and talked to about this has put this together, but I think it's really important that, like, if you can differentiate between primary and secondary emotions, and you can see how those play out in social media, that primary emotions are driving most of the problems within discourse online, right? So primary emotions are just the first emotion that we feel. It's usually really visceral, it's really strong, and it's usually one of four emotions. So it's either anger, fear, sadness, or joy. Did I get those right? Yes. So, and then we have this immediate reaction online. It's usually anger or fear, or we feel threatened or whatever. And we react right there in our primary emotion. And that is not the way to have a conversation. That is not the way to solve anything. If you've ever been in a relationship, you know that reacting while you're in your primary emotion is going to end really badly. That's not going to have a conducive, good conversation. Whereas if you wait it out a little bit and get into what your secondary emotions are and kind of flesh those out and see what's happening and why you're feeling that way, and have a better understanding of kind of the nuance of your emotion, you're more likely to, demonstrate the emotional intelligence that you need to in order to, have productive conversations online, make good decisions at work, whatever the case may be.
So it's kind of like the difference between immediately needing to drag people online by immediately responding, and maybe taking a sec to actually think about it and maybe then responding. I'm not saying don't respond, but have a more nuanced way of responding. And maybe if you could have the time to respond, maybe take a sec to actually write a blog post about it or an article about it, or something that requires a bit of self-editing, for example, that sort of thing, which obviously Twitter doesn't have. It just so happens that we're recording this on the same week as the 10-year commemoration / anniversary / whatever of the start of the Arab Spring. It just so happens it's in a couple of days, when Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor, lit himself on fire. That the whole tragedy that followed, then that is credited to spark the Tunisian uprising, and then obviously Egyptian and so on. And I was starting my undergrad studies when that happened. It was the same month, pretty much. I mean, I started in September 2010. That was in December 2010. And I remember very clearly, finishing first term. And by that time, the first two dictators had been toppled, the Tunisian one and the Egyptian one, Ben Ali and Mubarak. And a lot of signs in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, in Cairo, were thanking Facebook. And I remember this very well. And I had the same impression as they did on Facebook. It was kind of young, maybe a bit more innocent, sort of the darker crap that followed hadn't really happened yet. They hadn't developed that aspect of their technology. Actually, they hadn't developed it to the same extent as, the Cambridge Analytica model that followed and that sort of thing. It just, it's 10 years later. This isn't a conversation about the Arab Spring, but it's more, it's one of the many examples of the sort of the dark side. Like you can have the Arab Spring, and then you can also have the authoritarianism and the ISIS and all of that shit that followed. Obviously, it's not just because of social media. I'm not making that argument, but the nudge framework I think is actually helpful. The algorithm of YouTube, the see next, and how you can start with something that is relatively moderate, relatively decent, relatively just a decent video on really any topic, and it can take you down the line of either the white supremacist stuff or the Holocaust denying stuff or the ISIS stuff before they banned those ones, but they didn't really ban the first ones yet. Really dark corners of the internet that end up being boosted. And these people, I mentioned YouTube, but the Facebook groups are credited for bringing the QAnon folks together. And, I'm saying QAnon folks, which is not even fair because many of those were not actual adepts of QAnon. They get, you have some tendencies, you may have some doubts on something, some conspiratorial whatever. You get dragged into a group, or that group is suggested to you, then you have some, then there's a group mentality that gets formed, and there's bonding. A lot of loneliness gets, the incel movement, obviously I'm calling it a movement. The incel phenomenon is also indicative of this, I think. The question is, again, not an easy one, I apologize in advance. How would you even start by reflecting on those past 10 years? I mean, and I'm saying 10 years just because it's Arab Spring, but it doesn't have to actually be 10 years. On the developments of the past years, would you say that there are some positive signs? So let's try and end on a positive note. To this sort of increased awareness, at least. I think it's fair to say that people are more aware now than they have, I mean, just myself. I was not aware of most things before Cambridge Analytica, to be honest. And I was following Facebook especially pretty closely. I did see the horrors that happened in Syria kind of having their precursors on social media with the disinformation and the character assassinations and all of that, but I didn't really understand what that was until the Cambridge Analytica phenomenon, which is different. It's not the same thing, although there are some commonalities. Was exposed, and then we had a lot more data, essentially more information on that topic. So yeah, I'm throwing it at you. I'm really sorry. Yeah, give it a shot anyway.
So immediately when you said like, how do we look at that, or how do we like visualize that? I in my head was like, oh, well, a timeline. You would make a timeline and you would like put like, some of the negative things that happened, like maybe going down and what that was, and like how bad the impact was. And you would put the positives maybe going up in a different color, and you would see kind of this balance of the two and see if it really was a balance or if there was more bad or good. And how you quantify that is obviously very subjective. But in my head, like that was kind of my answer, like, oh, well, I would, look at the major events and the data and try to scale that and see if there's any, helpful way of visualizing this. I think when it comes to the awareness piece that you're talking about, I think there is so much more awareness, like so much more amongst the public, in large part thanks to, campaigns and films and things like that. And just, even news, like, I think you're right. Cambridge Analytica was like this huge turning point for a lot of people. And it really, I think, solidified that, Brexit was kind of part of that whole same dynamic and advertising debacle online and use of data. So I think the public attitude is changing has changed in the last 4 years quite a bit. And I think people are really starting to understand what's going on. I think employees, the ones that speak out especially, have been a huge driving force of that, the employees at these companies, being able to hear their stories and tell those stories, whether they're directly, told in like a blog post, or usually that's after they have quit their company, obviously, or, by reporters who gather that information for us and then tell their stories from them. I think those firsthand accounts are really, really powerful, because when we, have that example, it makes us trust more, right? When we can put a name and a face with a story and with social harm, that helps us really connect to that issue, right? And that's why statistics don't do much to convince people, but like a personal narrative about someone either struggling or going through something or experiencing joy or whatever, they'll connect to that. So the employee piece, I think what you said earlier, like the political and kind of government awareness of these issues is still lagging, but growing, like at a bit more of a snail's pace maybe than we would like to see. But all three of those things, right? Public, employee kind of sentiment, political stuff, like all of those awareness pieces are growing. I think the only problem remains with the leadership at some of these big companies, right? And leaders of some companies I think are great. I think Mark Benioff is an incredible leader by and large. But until you convince kind of the people in charge or just, regulate the crap out of them, it's really hard to make kind of meaningful change. But I think what will drive this is the fact that everyone else kind of around them is now putting pressure on these companies to change. So my hope is that in the face of that kind of, legislative pressure, fines, customers speaking out, ditching their products, whatever it may be, employees quitting, turnover costs a ton, bad PR, like all of those things kind of put together, hopefully kind of leads to that leadership self-awareness piece. And it might not be self-awareness in the way that you would want it to kind of naturally kind of come, like an insight and an aha moment and recognizing that maybe they could do a little bit better. And how do you do that? It might be a little more forced than that. But I mean, whatever it takes to get these companies to comply and to make products and services that actually benefit humanity rather than just, pull data from them to make themselves enriched. I think that's where you need to kind of look. So
yeah.
Does that answer your question? I feel like I rambled there. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think it was an impossible question, to be honest. So that was fine. I would say that there I have seen decent. I'm saying decent. I think my expectations are just so low as well. Progress on the Facebook and to a greater extent on the Twitter side when it comes to their social responsibilities. Again, I really think my expectations in the first place are a bit too low on this, and I think that I need to be a bit more, probably not as nice. But the around the US elections, we've seen the whole flagging thing on Twitter, for example, the fact that Facebook took a stance on QAnon. I'm not gonna say that there are no questions around how these tech companies manage the data. Essentially, I'm not saying that this was good. Period. I'm sure there are nuances to that as well, but and this would end up being these big what ifs of history. Like, what if they didn't do any of that? What if the algorithm was actually not just in place, but boosted on, which tends to happen on election times. The YouTube algorithm would continue encouraging these extremist content, and Twitter, Nazis being so comfortable on Twitter, and the white supremacists on Facebook, and all of that stuff. Who knows if it could have? And I'm not saying it would never. I'm not saying this is a done deal either. I'm saying that might have even been worse by now. Like, even as we're talking right now. If Facebook was letting QAnon meet the Republicans, meet the, just letting it all play out essentially, and the algorithm being the invisible kingmaker in some ways, although probably it's a bad metaphor. So kind of a hopeful note, I guess. I mean, in a certain way, is that, well, that's something. I'm not saying it's nothing. So it is something, definitely not enough. The antitrust laws when it comes to on Facebook, that's something interesting. I hope it actually does happen. That's my position. I think Facebook needs to be broken up. That's honestly my position on this. So let me ask you the book recommendation question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So I'm asking guests to recommend books. It's this new thing I'm doing. I totally stole it from Ezra Klein's show. And basically just to have recommended books. So can you recommend books on this topic or related topics, or even totally unrelated topics? And
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of good books on, different elements of kind of what's going on, right? So if you're interested in, say, the effects of tech on democracy, The People versus Tech by Jamie Bartlett is really good. Algorithms of Oppression. I think that's by Kathy O'Neill. Is that right? No, she's Weapons of Math
Math destruction. Yeah, yeah,
Destruction.
yeah.
That's really good as well. But my kind of the sources I drew on mostly for my book were primarily, well, interviews and then, psychology kind of stuff. So if you're interested like in emotional intelligence and learning more about that, the kind of classic book on emotional intelligence is just called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. That's a really good place to start. If you're interested in empathy, which would be where I would start, because I think that's the thing that's missing the most in the tech industry. There's a book called The Empathy Instinct, How to Build a More Civil Society by Peter Balgazet. And that one's really, really good. It's a few years old now. And then probably my favorite nonfiction book of all time is Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And that I think it's just really useful for me. And he has one called Homo Deus as well, which is obviously more about tech. But I think Sapiens is even more useful in the sense that it gives us this longitudinal view of humanity and makes us kind of consider where we are in that story and that journey and what we might look like if we kind of don't manage some of these challenges in a really kind of cooperative way. He talks a lot about collaboration in that book, which I think is hugely important for the challenges that we're facing right now. So those would be the three I'd recommend on the subjects. What did I just finish? Oh, I just finished a book called Good and Mad, which was really great, by Rebecca Traister. And that's about the revolutionary power of women's anger. That's like the subtitle. So I read a lot of books on like just different emotions. So that was one on anger, which was really cool. I'm reading one called Can't Even on Millennials and Why We're the Burnout Generation, by Ann Peterson. And then Prisoners of Geography is one of my like one of the best books I read this year. I had jury duty earlier this year and I read it like in a day. And it's super interesting. It's about how different countries act and behave and comport themselves because of like where they're situated geographically. So like the US, for instance, is like the crown jewel of where it is, right? Like it's between two oceans, it has two neighbors that it like, economically kind of like dominates over. And it doesn't have to be friends with anyone, whereas like, and it can be kind of an asshole. Whereas like a country that doesn't have any, ports or means of trade that's really easy, and they have like 8 neighbors around them, like they have to behave in a different way, and they're going to have like different cultural norms and stuff because of that. So I thought it's not strictly about psychology, but I thought for what I'm researching now and working on now is a book about America and kind of the psychology of America, which, hugely, hugely interesting and also difficult to talk about. So that one I read for that as a bit of research, and it was really, really good. So those are the ones that spring to mind. I wonder, you must have a lot because you talk to people all the time about this stuff.
I mentioned Jaron Lanier for a reason, because I have been reading his books lately. I have found them very, very useful. I tend to get into kind of like climate psychology now, not in any professional capacity, just as out of curiosity. So there's a book that I literally have here called Climate Psychology. I mean, that's easy to find. And you have, I'm starting to get into topics surrounding climate anxiety and the whole paralyzing nature of it, because it's something that I struggle with a lot with a number of friends of mine, that because I have an environmental science undergrad background, and it's something that, even knowing a tiny bit on how difficult the problem is and the consequences can be really, really terrifying. Yeah. And it's one of those things that I'm actually trying to deal with personally, just on a psychological level, in order to actually be useful, let's put it this way, and actually do something about it, rather than just, all doom and gloom, which tends to be the I don't know, I wouldn't say it's dominant. It has changed. I think the climate movement, the student movement, the youth movement, I forgot what it's called now, March for Our Future. Yeah, that's the one. Those things are definitely helping a lot to actually force the conversation to, probably using nudge theory without knowing it as well. Like, we're talking about them now. They are the future, so to speak. And kind of reframing things is what I'm trying to get at. So it happens on multiple levels or multiple fields, I guess, but they are all interrelated. So like, if I think of Jaron Lanier as like, well, it could be more interesting to someone who's more into technology than I am, let's say. but then some of these things on how addiction works, let's say, because he has that social media book, could be useful to thinking about how to think about climate change, for example. And then, I like to bounce around quite a bit. So I don't have any one. I'm basically very bad at making lists and giving recommendations, and I just jump around quite a lot. But yeah, that would be my answer.
That's a really good one. I'm going to look that up. I wrote it down. I think the thing about anxiety is cultural anxiety is so huge this year, right? Because we've spent the year just all being anxious together about an invisible threat. And that's essentially what climate change it poses, but on a grander scale, I think, right? And a more long-term scale. So I think we're going to see more of that. So yeah, being able to manage kind of collective mental health is something I work on a lot with my clients, and it's a really important, I think, area to focus on.
And I'll quickly mention, because I think it would be unfair to forget it. There's a book called Critical Pedagogy in Uncertain Times. I barely started it, so I don't know if I would recommend it, but so far so good. Okay. It seems very interesting, and it's about also, I think it's more the how to actually talk about it and how to actually think about, how to actually teach these important social skills, like, for example, emotional intelligence in uncertain times, as the title suggests. So that would be another recommendation. Well, anyway, Katy Cook, thanks a lot for your time. This has been fascinating and amazing and quite a lot of fun, to be honest.
Yeah, this is really good. This was a great way to start my day. Thank you. And end your day.
Yes, and end my day. Yeah.
Night, yeah.
All right, take care.
All right, you too.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.